Human life is governed by complex systems, large complex systems that have evolved from smaller complex systems that in turn ultimately have their roots in much more straightforward actions or particular responses to individual or given situations. These create multi-layered, interdependent complexities that shape the actions that we take and the world that we live in. Often these are unintended consequences, but ultimately they all reflect the priorities, the interests, and the self-interests of those for whom the decisions were taken. This is really the ultimate invisible hand, and it's this, rather than any conspiracy theory or any powerful individual or powerful group, that dictates the policies, the actions, and the decisions in all spheres of human life.
I don't know why she swallowed the fly. I know an old lady who swallowed a cow. I don't know how she swallowed a cow. She swallowed the cow to catch the goat. She swallowed the goat to catch the dog. She swallowed the dog to catch the cat. She swallowed the cat to catch the bird. She swallowed the bird to catch the spider that wriggled and jiggled and tingled inside her. She swallowed the spider to catch the fly. I don't know why she swallowed the fly. I know
It's now widely accepted, based on mitochondrial DNA analysis, that all of us evolved from the same roots in Africa. What's also widely accepted, but perhaps less widely known, is that Homo sapiens weren't the first hominins to venture out of Africa. Australopithecus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus did so up to 2 million years earlier, as did Homo neanderthalis around 300,000 years ago. Evidence suggests that Homo sapiens started to leave Africa around 70,000 years ago, and that within 30,000 years had rendered extinct all the previous lineages of hominins. Although they do live on in all of us, in that due to crossbreeding prior to extinction, there's today a little bit of caveman and cavewoman in all of us. Anyone of European ancestry is likely to be a few percent Neanderthal. So if you happen to encounter any white supremacists, you might enjoy pointing out to them that not only is their family line, like all of us, indigenously African, but in fact, they're not even pure human. Money has existed since the earliest civilizations. People like Professor Nell Ferguson have tried to popularize a myth that earliest civilizations used barter, but in fact evidence suggests that they use money and accounting in the forms of tally sticks or tablets, stone ones, not iPads, and that as societies grew in size, this became an important basis of social organization and control. In the ancient world, many, and in some cases most slaves, were actually debt slaves, that is, debtors and or their family members taken as security for or a consequence of non-payment. The centralization of this and the power associated with it seems to have played a large factor in the earliest development of the state, 5,000 years ago. The state used obligations and debt cancellation to enforce the will of the leaders, whether unitary or oligopoly, or in ancient Greece and later in Aztec Mexico, popular rule. Debt cancellation was so successful in helping to maintain social order that regular jubilees became a cause for celebration and feast days. Today, we continue to celebrate the longevity of rulers through events like jubilees, although we don't seem to get the same benefits of having our debts cancelled that our predecessors did in more civilized times. The aggregation of private wealth changed this dynamic so that over time, instead of the state controlling debts and obligations and being the monopoly or dominant creditor, it began to compete against private lenders, ultimately having to borrow from them, to the extent that Herodotus wrote of Pharaoh Khufu's daughter having to work in a brothel to raise the necessary funding for her father's ambitious pyramid project. Although, like many morality tales involving debt, this is probably apocryphal. Religions were amongst the first institutions to use the power of acquired wealth to control the masses through debt, to the extent that the Christian Church used debt forgiveness as one of its sweeteners for recruiting crusaders pressed into service against Islamic states in the religious wars of 1,000 years ago. Conflict between states had always resulted in financial and economic rewards for the victors being borne by the losers. Genghis Khan had reportedly claimed that the greatest joy for a man is to defeat his enemies, to drive them before him, to take from them all that they possess, to see those they love in tears, to ride their horses, and to hold their wives and daughters in his arms, which may explain why the great Khan ended up with over 500 concubines, and why, to this day, 1 in 8 men in Asia are descended from Genghis Khan. The rewards led to greater competition between nations, which resulted in further borrowing by states to fund these adventures, and by the 14th century, the great Venetian banking families had become of far greater financial substance and significance than prototypical states such as England that borrowed from them, and in England's case, defaulted. By the 17th century, states, the corporate sector, and the financial sector had all evolved to something that would be much more recognizable today, just in time for the great geopolitical competition of the Age of Discovery. State debts have always been different from private debts. The state has always enjoyed a different relationship with its so-called lenders. State defaults to the private sector have never carried the same consequences as individual defaults. When Edward I defaulted in the 13th century, he simply changed the laws of England to banish from the kingdom the Jewish lenders from whom he borrowed, unless they forgave the debts and agreed to convert to Christianity. From this crude exercise of state power, more nuanced distinctions have evolved over time. The state also has powers that private individuals don't. In the 19th century, the British government introduced a temporary levy over all its citizens for 1 year to fund the cost of the Napoleonic Wars. It then renewed that again the following year and the following year, and it continues to renew it every year since. It's called income tax. Also, the state can flex its power as the issuer of currency. In theory, there are obligations imposed on the state, but as we discovered when the gold standard was suspended during World War I, or when it was abolished during the Great Depression, or when privately owned gold was confiscated by the US government, or even when the gold standard was vestigially consigned to history by Richard Nixon closing the gold window in 1971. These restraints, they were only arbitrary. They were only as good as long as the state agreed to impose them upon itself. This distinction has been noted by empirical economists today, who've started to formulate what the actual role of government is in modern economies. We tend to label this fiscal policy, the management or mismanagement by governments of surpluses or deficits. Deficits, which are often mistermed as increases in government debts, the accounting term debits would actually be more accurate, are simply the process of the government spending money into the national economy. Economic activity within any economy reflects the flows within that economy. Each economy can receive net inflows or outflows. In aggregate, for the global economy, these must sum to zero, relating to imports and exports. Although ultimately these should be seen as the exchange of the importer's currency for the exporter's resources, whether in the form of natural resources or labour. In addition, the sum of flows within an economy reflect government spending, i.e. so-called deficits, and private sector spending, which increasingly in a modern economy involves credit or borrowing. So basically, net exports plus foreign direct investment plus government deficit plus private sector net outlays equals the sum of economic activity. When these increase at increasing rates, then an economy grows. When the rate of increase begins to slow or flattens or falls, then economic growth slows down or peaks or even contracts. Since the global financial crisis, policymakers to greater and lesser degrees have directed flows increasingly towards capital markets and to asset prices. This has bolstered these, and it's helped to rehabilitate the financial sector, which is largely still existentially dependent on aggregate asset prices remaining inflated. Sporadically since then, policymakers have tried to dial back from this, but each time they've done so, they've failed, highlighting the dependence of the global financial sector on maintaining these prices. The current episode that we're experiencing of monetary tightening and financial asset disposals by central banks, although so far, in fact, these have been fairly minimal, is the most serious attempt yet. This year, we've already seen the early consequences of this, and we're already beginning to see rumblings, whether in the UK pension sector or with European mega banks, of fractures in the most fragile part of the system. It seems highly likely that once again, having tried to create space to do so, policymakers will pivot back to use this space by cutting rates and by aggressively buying assets again. Most likely this will drive up asset prices once again, and it will boost the financial sector. But every time we do this, the consequences of making more room to fix bigger problems in the future simply get greater and greater, and there's a risk that one day we'll have run out of road because we've created a problem that's just too big to fix. In my view, we're still a long way away from that, but the current bump in the road can get far bumpier before we re-emerge back to a smoother ride. And there's a very good chance that the current bump will actually seem pancake flat when we compare it to future episodes. One of the greatest modern economists, Hyman Minsky, termed processes such as this futile and ultimately costly exercise in trying to stabilize an inherently unstable system. And I don't think there are any indications yet that the system is likely to change in the short term. So the best that any of us can do is to be aware that this just isn't sustainable. It is likely to get more volatile, but there will be patches of smooth road in between, and we can plan accordingly. Of course, there is another meaning when we use the word sustainable, a much more important one than existential threats to financial markets, namely existential threats to the planet itself. Resources are the ultimate limit to growth, and this is why I recently, along with 40 or so much more eminent, more important experts, signed this letter to Andrew Bailey at the Bank of England. It's the second such letter that I've been involved in sending to Governor Bailey. He replied to the first one, but as far as I'm aware, he hasn't replied to this one yet. Even if he does reply, I very much doubt that he will, as we've all asked him to do, break the climate finance doom loop. In fact, that doom loop seems to be becoming increasingly self-reinforcing. Over 20 years ago, some well-intentioned people at the United Nations came up with the Millennium Development Goals. These evolved into the Social Development Goals, which in turn have morphed into being the basis for what's now known as ESG, Environmental, Social and Governance. That's something you're going to be hearing more and more and more about in the future. But while it was no doubt extremely well intended, the attempts to conserve a habitable planet have actually resulted in just creating a profit center, a whole business, a whole new business sector that is basically exploiting intentions to create sustainability in a way that is detrimental to those intentions. It's actually become far easier and far more financially rewarding to observe adherence to ESG criteria than it is to do anything meaningful about sustainability. Just as we've created unsustainable economic policy, this unsustainable environmental policy is also likely to continue to seem as if it's working until it's obvious that it doesn't, by which time it may be too late. Previous hominins had survived on this planet for almost 2 million years until Homo sapiens played a large part in rendering them extinct. Homo sapiens have only been in existence for 70,000 years, and yet Homo sapiens actually represent the biggest known threat to their own existence.